Tonight, we step into a story older than empires, older than memory itself. A tale not just of gods and mortals, but of love, loss, and the fragile balance that keeps the world alive. Beneath the golden fields where flowers once bloomed, a secret was sown, a daughter stolen, a mother's grief, and a choice that bound the earth to an eternal rhythm. This isn't just about a myth whispered in temples or carved into stone. It is about why the seasons turn, why winter takes hold, and why spring always returns. It is about how joy and sorrow are woven together, and how the love between mother and child became the very heartbeat of the earth. So before you close your eyes and drift into dreams, ask yourself, what if the change of every season was not chance but promise? What if every bloom and every falling leaf was part of a bargain struck long ago? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we walk with Persephone and Hades, and in their story, the beginning of the seasons will unfold. Long ago, before people measured time with calendars and clocks, the earth was alive with a rhythm of its own. The air was sweet with the smell of ripe grain, and the fields stretched farther than the eye could see. Golden stalks swayed like gentle waves of the sea, and the soft hum of bees danced above them. It was a world wrapped in calm, a world where every blade of grass seemed to breathe under the loving hand of one goddess. Her name was Demeter, the one who cared for the land itself. She was more than a caretaker of crops. She was the heartbeat of harvest, the reason fields turned green and gold, and the reason families never went hungry. Every day she walked among the rows of wheat and barley, her steps light yet filled with purpose, her fingers brushing the grain as if greeting old friends. Wherever her touch lingered, life grew stronger, brighter, fuller. Her presence was not only seen in the plants but felt in the very air, as though the earth leaned closer to listen to her every word. The farmers in distant villages did not always see her face, but they saw her blessings in their baskets full of bread and fruit. They told stories by firelight of a goddess who gave them more than food. She gave them peace of mind, and they prayed to her with grateful hearts. Yet beyond the whispers of villagers and the warmth of her harvest, there was something more that made Demeter's fields magical. When she raised her hand to the sky, the sun seemed to shine brighter, and when she lowered it, soft rains fell with perfect gentleness. It was as if the heavens and the earth obeyed her silent command. No one dared to disturb her work, for they knew it was sacred. Still, even in this harmony, there was a silence beneath the golden beauty. It was the silence of waiting, as though the fields themselves knew a story was about to begin, one that would change the world forever. And in this silence, a figure often appeared, light and full of laughter, running through the meadows as if they belonged to her. Persephone, Demeter's daughter, was the joy of the earth, the very echo of her mother's heart. But this is not yet her story. This is the moment before, when the earth still breathed without fear, when the crops bent only to the wind and not to sorrow. Tonight, as you close your eyes and listen, imagine yourself lying in those golden fields, the sun warm on your face, the whisper of grain around you, the voice of Demeter humming through the air like a lullaby. Let it carry you into dreams, for in these dreams the tale of Persephone and the birth of the seasons will unfold. And it all begins here, in the golden fields where peace was once eternal. In the heart of those wide golden fields, where the crops swayed like gentle oceans, there bloomed pockets of color more brilliant than any sunset. Wildflowers of every shade painted the meadows with strokes of red, violet, and blue. And it was here that Persephone loved to wander. She laughed as she moved, her fingers brushing the soft petals as if each one were a secret waiting to be shared. Her voice carried like the song of a bird, and even the flowers seemed to lift their faces higher to catch her joy. Demeter watched her daughter with a heart so full it felt as if the earth itself pulsed in rhythm with their bond. Persephone was not only her child, but also her companion, her living reflection. Where Demeter's hands had strength and patience to coax life from the soil, Persephone's touch was light and playful, calling blossoms to bloom with her laughter. Together they were balance, the wisdom of a mother and the innocence of a daughter, shaping the land with love so deep it was felt by every living thing. The animals of the fields knew her footsteps well. Deer lifted their heads when she approached, not in fear but in trust, and rabbits hopped close as if eager to share in her games. Even the wind seemed to bend around her, carrying the fragrance of flowers to follow her wherever she went. To Demeter, watching Persephone was like watching spring itself come alive again and again. She saw her daughter's hair glinting like woven sunlight, her eyes bright with curiosity, and her smile as endless as the horizon. Every moment with her was a gift, one that Demeter treasured more than all the golden harvests of the world. She often joined Persephone in her wanderings, weaving crowns of flowers and resting them on her daughter's head. They would laugh together, lying in the grass, making shapes out of clouds that drifted lazily across the sky. Their bond was unbreakable, a love that no darkness had ever touched. Yet the earth has a way of balancing joy with silence. While Demeter cherished every moment, a faint unease sometimes tugged at her heart, as though the world itself whispered that perfection could not last forever. Still, she pushed the thought aside, holding tightly to the sight of her daughter dancing among blossoms. For in that moment, nothing else mattered. To hear Persephone laugh was to believe the world would always remain bright and kind. And so the days passed, filled with warmth and tenderness, mother and daughter side by side, unaware of the shadows that watched from afar. This was the season of joy, the time when flowers bowed to Persephone's touch and Demeter's heart knew only peace. It was a chapter of happiness, written so deeply into the soil that even now, when you close your eyes, you might feel the brush of wildflowers against your skin and hear the laughter of a girl loved beyond measure. When winter loosened its quiet grip on the earth, a soft stirring began to ripple across the land. The snow that once blanketed the hills melted into gentle streams, and the ground woke slowly, stretching after its long sleep. Birds returned first, their wings flashing against the pale sky as they filled the air with songs that had been silent for months. Their melodies rose and fell, like secrets shared between the trees, and the forests seemed to lean closer just to listen. Soon blossoms followed, pushing through the soil with delicate courage, their petals unfolding in shades of pink, white, and gold. The meadows became a quilt of color, and the breeze carried scents so sweet it felt like breathing in a promise. Each flower was a small lantern of joy, lighting the fields with new life, and Persephone was at the center of it all. Her laughter floated through the air, light and free, blending with the chorus of the birds. Wherever she stepped, the earth seemed eager to answer, flowers bending toward her, grasses trembling as if greeting a dear friend. Her voice carried like sunlight, wrapping itself around every living thing, a reminder that spring had truly arrived. Demeter watched with quiet pride, knowing that her daughter's presence was more than playful wandering. It was a blessing, one that stirred the very heart of the earth awake. When Persephone ran through the fields, her hair streaming behind her, it was as though she carried spring itself in her hands. She twirled among the blossoms, her feet brushing the soft ground, and the fields bloomed brighter, as if to keep up with her joy. The animals joined her dance too, birds swooping low, deer stepping into the open, and even the smallest insects humming in harmony. Each sound, each movement, became part of a larger song, one that told of renewal, hope, and the endless cycle of seasons. Yet beneath all this brightness, there was a strange stillness that no one spoke of. It lingered faintly, like a shadow at the edge of the meadow, unseen yet present. But for now, the world belonged to Persephone's laughter. She sang to the blossoms, braided flowers into her hair, and knelt in the grass to greet the smallest blooms, treating each one as precious as a jewel. Her joy was so pure that the earth itself seemed to sigh with relief, the long months of winter finally forgotten. As the day drew on, the sky softened into shades of pale orange and rose, the warmth of the sun slowly fading, but the sound of Persephone's laughter lingered, echoing through the valleys like a promise that spring was here to stay. If you listen closely, even now, you might still hear it carried on the breeze, a whisper of spring that will forever remind the world of the season she brought to life. Far beneath the golden fields and blooming meadows, there stretched a kingdom hidden from the warmth of the sun. This was the Underworld, a vast realm of shadows and silence, where rivers of silver mist wound through endless caverns. At its heart sat Hades, the ruler of this quiet world, cloaked in solemn dignity. His throne was carved from obsidian stone, gleaming faintly in the dim light. Yet even with all his power, he was not free from longing. For though he commanded respect from gods and mortals alike, his days were marked by solitude, and his nights by the heavy weight of silence. Hades had everything a god could ever possess. Jewels sparkled in his halls, and treasures lay hidden in vaults untouched by time. Spirits moved quietly through his realm, respectful and obedient, yet none of this filled the emptiness he carried. The underworld was vast, but it was also lonely, and the laughter of life above had never reached him. He was a guardian of order, a keeper of balance, but what he craved was something far simpler. He longed for companionship, someone who could share in his world and see past the shadows to the heart within. From his throne, he often cast his gaze upward. Though no mortal could see him, his eyes pierced through layers of rock and soil, reaching the fields where life blossomed so freely. And there, among the flowers, he saw her, Persephone. Her laughter drifted down like sunlight breaking through cracks, reaching even the coldest corners of his domain. Each time she bent to gather blossoms, each time her voice rose in joy, something stirred in Hades that had long been quiet. He was not moved by her beauty alone, though she shone brighter than the stars he rarely glimpsed. It was her spirit, her warmth, her joy so pure that it seemed to breathe life into everything it touched. The more he watched, the deeper his longing grew. Yet Hades was no reckless god. He was careful, measured, bound by duty as much as desire. He told himself he had no right to disturb the world above, no right to take what belonged to the light. But still, he could not turn away. Day after day, his gaze returned to the meadows, drawn to Persephone, as if she carried the very key to the emptiness in his soul. The underworld remained quiet, but within its ruler's heart, change had begun. What had once been a kingdom of silence now trembled with an unspoken yearning. And though Persephone laughed, unaware of the eyes that watched her, the seeds of a story were already being sown. For the god of shadows, who had lived so long without joy, had glimpsed a brightness he could not forget, and the earth above would never be the same again. The sun rose higher than usual, casting a soft golden glow across the fields, and the world seemed to hum with life. The meadow stretched endlessly before Persephone, alive with blossoms so vivid they almost seemed to sing. Reds as bright as fire, purples as deep as twilight, and yellows glowing like captured sunlight painted the earth in every direction. Each flower leaned toward her, as if calling her name, and she could not help but wander further, her heart filled with delight. She laughed as butterflies circled her hair, and her hands reached out to gather petals as delicate as whispers. On most days, she stayed near the familiar fields where her mother worked, never straying too far. But today was different. Something in the air tugged at her, a sweet perfume carried on the breeze, inviting her to follow where it led. Her feet brushed through tall grasses, and her eyes sparkled with wonder as she discovered new blossoms she had never seen before. She bent low to the ground, admiring a cluster of lilies that shone like silver under the sun, their fragrance wrapping around her like a spell. Persephone's heart raced with excitement, not from fear, but from the thrill of discovery. Every step felt like stepping into another dream, each flower a secret gift waiting to be found. She twirled in the meadow, her dress catching the light, her laughter spilling out so brightly that even the birds seemed to pause and listen. The meadow was alive, but in that moment, it felt as though it belonged only to her. Above, the sky was vast and endless, painted with soft clouds drifting lazily across the blue. The warmth of the day pressed gently against her skin, and she felt as though she could wander forever, carried by the magic of the blossoms. She chased the bright flashes of butterflies, knelt beside patches of violets, and filled her arms with flowers until they overflowed. Time slipped away, unnoticed, as she drifted deeper and deeper into the meadow's embrace. Far behind her, the familiar sounds of her mother's work faded into silence. Persephone did not notice how far she had come. too caught in the wonder of the meadow's colors. Yet something lingered in the air, quiet and unseen. A hush fell between the songs of birds, a stillness that wrapped itself beneath the laughter. Though the meadow was bright and blooming, there was a weight hidden in its beauty, a whisper waiting to be heard. Persephone paused, her hands full of blossoms, her gaze lifting to the horizon. The flowers swayed gently, their petals brushing against her arms like tiny voices urging her forward. She smiled, taking another step, unknowing that this path was leading her toward a moment that would change her life forever. The meadow bloomed brighter than ever, as if holding its breath, waiting for the story that was about to unfold. The air was warm and still, filled with the perfume of flowers and the soft hum of bees, when the ground beneath Persephone's feet began to tremble. At first, it was faint, so gentle it might have been mistaken for the sigh of the earth, but then it deepened into a low rumble that stirred the meadow. The blossoms quivered, as if a hidden wind passed through them, and the soil shifted beneath the tall grasses. Persephone stopped where she stood, her arms full of flowers, her laughter fading as the strange sound echoed through the silence. She looked around, expecting to see a storm rolling in, or perhaps a herd of deer bounding across the fields. But the sky above was clear and endless. The sun shone as brightly as ever, yet the trembling grew stronger, pulsing through the ground in steady beats, like the footsteps of something vast and unseen. The birds lifted suddenly into the air, wings beating in a rush of panic, their cries piercing the calm. Even the butterflies vanished, leaving the meadow eerily still. Then, with a sound like a sigh breaking open, the earth beneath Persephone split. A dark crack traced its way through the meadow, thin at first, then widening with a groan as soil crumbled into the depths. Grass and flowers fell away, swallowed by the growing fissure, and a cold breath of air rose from below. Persephone gasped, stumbling back, clutching her bundle of blossoms tightly against her chest. Her heart pounded in her ears, and for the first time that day, wonder was replaced by fear. The fissure stretched longer, jagged lines racing through the golden field, dividing it as though the earth itself had drawn a scar. Persephone knelt, peering into the darkness, but no bottom could be seen. The air that rose carried the scent of stone and fire, sharp and heavy, so different from the sweetness of spring around her. It felt as though the meadow had opened a secret door to another world, one hidden far beneath her mother's lands. She stood frozen, caught between awe and terror. The crack did not roar or rage like a storm. It simply lingered, a silent invitation, waiting. The flowers in her arms slipped from her grasp, their bright petals falling into the shadows where the earth had split. She reached out instinctively as though to catch them, but they vanished quickly, their colors swallowed by the dark. The ground grew still again, the rumble fading until only silence remained. Yet the fissure stayed, black and deep, its edges raw with freshly broken stone. Persephone shivered, a strange pull stirring in her chest, an unease she could not explain. She glanced behind her, wishing for the familiar sight of her mother, but she had wandered too far. Alone in the vast meadow, with the earth torn open before her, she realized she had stepped into a moment that could never be undone. The crack waited, patient and unyielding, a doorway to something she did not yet understand. From the shadows of the crack, a sound rose that was unlike anything Persephone had ever heard. It was the deep thundering of hooves striking stone, a steady rhythm that echoed from the hidden depths below. The ground shivered again, soft at first, then stronger, as if the earth itself was announcing the arrival of something powerful. Persephone stepped back, her eyes wide, the meadow around her swaying in uneasy silence. Out of the darkness, two gleaming eyes appeared, fierce and glowing like embers. Then came another pair, and another, until four fiery gazes shone through the gloom. Black horses emerged, their manes wild and flowing like streams of shadow, their hooves sparking faint fire as they struck the broken earth. The air grew heavy with their presence, and yet they moved with grace, their bodies sleek and strong, as though carved from the night itself. Behind them, rising from the fissure, came a chariot unlike any Persephone had ever seen. It was wrought from dark metal that gleamed as though it had drunk in the light of stars long forgotten. Its wheels turned with a low groan, and the reins of silver thread caught against the sunlight as if woven from moonlight itself. Standing tall within it was the figure of Hades. His form was stern, his cloak black as midnight, his crown glimmering faintly with gems that had never known the touch of daylight. His eyes held the depth of endless caverns, but behind their stillness burned a quiet longing. The chariot climbed fully into the meadow, the horses pawing at the ground as if impatient, their breath rolling out like mist. Persephone's heart beat quickly, torn between fear and awe. She had heard whispers of the god of the underworld, but never had she imagined him so real, so close, or so commanding. His presence filled the meadow, as though the shadows themselves bent to greet him. Hades held the reins loosely, his gaze fixed upon Persephone. He did not speak, yet his silence carried weight, like the hush of the air before a storm. The earth around the fissure seemed to wait, listening. Persephone clutched her hands to her chest, her flowers long forgotten, and took a hesitant step backward. But still, she could not look away. The horses stamped, the chariot wheels creaked, and the dark god stood tall, watching her with an expression that was not cruel, but unreadable. It was as though he had risen from his lonely realm, not to frighten, but to claim a place he had long sought. The meadow, once filled with song, now held its breath. Even the wind stilled, as though bowing to the figure who had emerged. In that moment, Persephone felt the weight of something greater than herself pressing against her heart. She stood at the edge of a choice she did not yet understand, while the chariot of darkness and the god who guided it waited in silence. The earth had opened, and from it had come a destiny that could not be ignored. The meadow that had moments before sparkled with light now seemed to dim, as though a veil had been drawn across the sky. Persephone felt the warmth of the sun fade from her skin, replaced by a chill that prickled down her arms. Shadows spread across the field, long and dark, spilling outward from the black chariot and the towering figure who stood upon it. She clutched her hands tightly together, her breath quickening as her heart pounded like a drum inside her chest. Her eyes rose slowly, first to the massive horses, whose fiery gazes glowed with otherworldly light, then to the chariot itself, with its wheels sharp and gleaming as though cut from night. Finally, she looked up at him, Hades. His presence was heavy and still, yet his gaze did not pierce her with cruelty. Instead, it held her in a silence that was both strange and powerful, leaving her caught between awe and fear. She had never seen a god like him before, one whose power felt so absolute and yet so lonely. Persephone trembled, though not only from fear. Wonder mingled with her dread, pulling her in two directions at once. She felt like a bird caught between flight and stillness, her body urging her to run while her heart whispered to remain. The shadows around her grew deeper, curling through the grasses and flowers until even their bright colors seemed muted. The meadow that had moments before sung with joy now bent under the weight of silence, as if the world itself was waiting. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She wanted to call for her mother, to cry out for the familiar safety of Demeter's arms, yet her voice caught in her throat. Her wide eyes met Hades once more, and she felt as though he could see every thought in her mind, every flicker of fear, every spark of curiosity. His expression did not change, yet something in the way he watched her seemed to soften, as though he too understood her fear. A breeze rose suddenly, rushing through the meadow with a whispering sound, lifting Persephone's hair and the hem of her dress. The flowers bent with it, their petals trembling, as though bowing to the god who had come from below. Persephone's gaze flickered upward to the sky, searching for light, but even the sun seemed dimmed, its rays struggling against the deepening shadows. The world above still existed, but it felt far away, distant, as if it belonged to another life. Her hands trembled as she took a single step back, her foot pressing against the soft grass, the sound sharp in the silence. The chariot loomed before her, the horses restless, their hooves striking sparks as they pawed the ground. The fissure behind them gaped wide, breathing cold air into the meadow. Persephone's frightened glance held everything. Her longing for safety, her awe at the god before her, her fear of what the shadows meant. She stood in that moment between two worlds, the light of her childhood and the darkness of something unknown. And though she did not yet know it, her life had already begun to change forever. The silence in the meadow grew so heavy that even the birds seemed to hold their songs. Persephone stood frozen, her breath shallow, her wide eyes fixed on the figure before her. Hades did not speak, yet his presence filled the space like thunder without sound. His dark cloak hung around him like midnight itself, and the crown upon his head caught what little light remained, glinting faintly with cold fire. Still, there was no anger in his gaze, no harshness in his movements. Instead, there was something softer, something unexpected. Slowly, with the calm of a man who knew the weight of his every action, Hades lifted his hand. His fingers extended toward her, not forceful, not demanding, but open. It was an unspoken invitation, one that carried with it 1,000 possibilities. Persephone's heart raced as she stared at that hand. It was strong, steady, the hand of a god who ruled an entire realm, yet it trembled faintly with something unguarded, something almost human. Persephone felt the pull of two worlds pressing against her. Behind her lay the meadow she knew, bright and alive, filled with her mother's love and the warmth of the sun. Before her stood the god of shadows, silent but offering something she could not yet name. Her chest rose and fell quickly, and she took a step forward without realizing it, then stopped, her toes pressed into the grass, her body trembling with indecision. Hades said nothing, but his stillness was not cold. It was patient. He waited, his hand suspended between them like a bridge. Persephone's fingers twitched at her side. She thought of her mother, of the laughter they shared, of the crowns of flowers woven beneath the sky. Then she looked into Hades' eyes and saw the vast loneliness that stretched behind them, an endless silence that no riches of the underworld could fill. It stirred something in her, something she did not understand but could not turn away from. The meadow seemed to fade around her, the colors dulling as if the world itself was holding its breath. The wind stilled, the flowers bent low, and all that remained was the space between her and the outstretched hand. She could not speak, her voice caught in her throat, but her thoughts swirled like rushing water. Was it fear that made her hesitate? Or was it the strange spark of curiosity that urged her to move closer? Persephone's lips parted, but still no words came. The choice was hers, though it was not spoken aloud. Her heartbeat thundered, as though echoing the hooves of the black horses that pawed impatiently at the ground. And yet Hades remained still, silent, his hand offered with a solemn grace. It was a choice unspoken, a moment stretched thin between light and shadow. Persephone stood trembling at its edge, knowing that whatever path she chose, her life would never again be the same. The meadow held its breath as Persephone stood before the dark chariot. The world around her dimmed and waiting. The horses pawed at the ground, their eyes glowing like embers, their manes flowing as though woven from shadows. Hades did not rush her. He only kept his hand extended, his gaze steady and silent. At last, with a trembling heart, Persephone placed her fingers into his. The moment she did, the earth beneath them stirred once more, and the fissure widened with a groan that seemed to echo from the depths of time itself. The chariot shifted, its wheels gleaming in the fading light, and Hades guided her gently onto its platform. Persephone's breath came quickly, her eyes darting to the meadow she had known all her life. She saw the flowers she had dropped still scattered on the grass, their colors bright against the dark soil. She saw the horizon where her mother worked far away, unaware of the silence that had fallen. For one fleeting moment, Persephone thought to run back, to flee into her mother's arms. But the pull of the underworld was already upon her, the horses restless, the crack yawning wide like a gate waiting to be crossed. With a command as soft as a whisper, Hades drew the reins, and the horses leapt forward. The chariot moved with startling grace, carrying them into the heart of the fissure. The world of light fell away behind them as the earth swallowed their path. Persephone clutched the rail of the chariot, her breath stolen by the speed, her heart pounding with fear and wonder alike. They descended through winding tunnels of stone, where walls glittered faintly with crystals that caught the dim light. Streams of silver trickled along the paths, their waters glowing as if touched by starlight. The air grew cooler, heavier, filled with the scent of deep earth and unseen fire. Persephone's eyes widened as she looked around, astonished by the strange beauty hidden beneath the world she had always known. Though the journey carried her away from everything familiar, the chariot did not jolt or strike fear into her bones. It moved with surprising gentleness, steady as a lullaby woven from shadows. She felt the wind of their passage lift her hair and cool her flushed cheeks, and for a moment she forgot her fear, overcome instead by the mystery of this hidden realm. Hades did not speak, but his presence beside her was calm, unyielding, yet strangely protective. He held the reins firmly, guiding the black horses through twisting caverns and across bridges of stone that arched above rivers, glowing with pale light. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with 1,000 unspoken thoughts that neither dared to voice. Finally, the tunnels widened, and before Persephone stretched a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in shadow, its halls lit by fires that burned without smoke. Towers of black stone rose from the depths, and rivers of shimmering silver wound around them like veins of light. This was the Underworld, the kingdom of Hades, and as the chariot carried her deeper within, Persephone realized that her journey had only just begun. The chariot slowed as it entered a vast cavern, and Persephone felt the stillness of the underworld press gently against her. She had expected darkness alone, a place of endless shadow and stone, but what unfolded before her was something she had never imagined. Quiet rivers wound through the caverns like ribbons of glass, their waters glowing faintly with silver light. They moved without a sound, so smooth and calm it seemed as if the earth itself was breathing softly in its sleep. Persephone's eyes widened as she looked closer. Along the riverbanks grew trees unlike any she had seen in the world above. Their trunks shimmered as though carved from crystal, and their branches stretched high, heavy with leaves that gleamed silver in the dim glow. The air was cool and carried a faint sweetness, the scent of minerals and deep earth mingling together. It was quiet, yet the silence was not empty. It was a silence filled with secrets, like a library of the world's oldest stories waiting to be told. Hades guided the horses carefully along the banks, and Persephone leaned out slightly, her gaze caught by gems that dotted the cavern walls. They glowed in hues of sapphire, emerald, and ruby, casting soft colors across the waters and the silver trees. The gems pulsed faintly, as though alive, their light flickering like stars trapped deep beneath the ground. The cavern sparkled with quiet wonder, and for a moment, Persephone forgot her fear, entranced by the strange beauty around her. The horses slowed, their hooves clinking softly against stone, and the chariot drifted forward as if carried by the silence itself. Persephone's reflection shimmered faintly in the silver river, her hair glowing golden against the pale light. She reached out and touched the edge of the chariot, wishing she could dip her fingers into the water, but something in its stillness kept her from doing so. It was as though the river carried ancient magic, and she felt that to disturb it would be to break a promise she could not yet understand. They passed beneath great arches of stone, where vines of glowing crystal clung like frozen lightning. Persephone tilted her head back, marveling at their brilliance, her heart stirred by awe. She had always loved the flowers and fields of the world above, but here was a different kind of beauty, quiet and unspoken, hidden from mortal eyes. It felt mysterious and endless, like stepping into a dream she was not sure she wanted to wake from. Hades remained silent beside her, his face calm, his eyes steady as he watched her wonder. He did not need to speak, for he could see that she was beginning to understand that the underworld was not only a place of shadow and sorrow, it was also a realm of stillness and hidden treasures, a place where silence carried its own kind of music. And as Persephone gazed into the glowing rivers and silver trees, she felt the first stirrings of curiosity about this new world that would soon become a part of her story. The chariot rolled to a stop at the edge of a great hall, its towering arches carved from black stone that shimmered faintly in the light of unseen fires. Persephone stepped down carefully, her eyes wide as she took in the sight before her. The throne room of Hades stretched farther than she could see, its walls lined with pillars that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. High above, the ceiling disappeared into shadow, yet tiny sparks of light glimmered there, like stars trapped in an endless night. At the center of the hall rose a throne of obsidian, tall and sharp, its surface polished until it gleamed like dark water. Jewels were set into its frame, glowing faintly in shades of deep crimson and sapphire, as though they held pieces of the underworld's secret fires. It was beautiful in its strength, but it was also cold, a seat that spoke of power carried with silence. Hades walked beside her, his steps steady, his cloak trailing across the stone floor. His eyes moved slowly over his kingdom, as though reminding himself of all that belonged to him. Yet there was no pride in his expression, only a deep stillness, as though he carried the weight of loneliness that even a throne could not ease. Persephone followed his gaze and saw the vastness of the underworld laid out beyond the hall. Rivers of silver stretched into the distance, carrying their quiet light through valleys of stone. Gardens of pale trees shimmered faintly, their leaves rustling without sound. Bridges arched over streams that glowed with hidden fire, and caverns opened into chambers lit by gems that pulsed with soft colors. It was a kingdom vast and unending, filled with wonders and mysteries, yet Persephone felt its silence pressing on her chest. Hades stopped at the foot of his throne and turned to her. His face was calm, his voice still absent, yet his presence asked her to look deeper. She studied him quietly, noticing the way his shoulders carried the weight of authority, the way his crown caught the glow of hidden gems. Yet behind his steady eyes she saw the truth of this kingdom, a truth she had not expected. He was alone, ruler of countless spirits, master of a realm as endless as night. Yet he walked in solitude, his throne a place of shadows rather than companionship. Persephone lowered her eyes, her fingers brushing lightly against her dress. She thought of her mother's laughter, of the warmth of the fields above, and then of this man before her who commanded so much, yet stood surrounded by emptiness. She felt a strange pull within her, part fear, part compassion, and part curiosity she could not name. Hades lifted his hand once more, not to command, but to show. The hall, the rivers, the glowing gems, the silent caverns, all of it was his. And yet, in that moment, Persephone understood that he wanted more than a kingdom. He wanted someone to share it with, someone to bring light to the shadows. And as she stood there in the vast throne room, Persephone realized that she was at the heart of a story that was only beginning to unfold. Persephone sat quietly in the vast hall, her eyes drifting toward the silver rivers that wound beyond the throne and the glowing gems that dotted the cavern walls. The beauty of the underworld was undeniable, yet it felt heavy, weighed down by silence that clung to every corner. Her heart longed for the warmth of the sun, the laughter of birds, and the gentle touch of her mother's hands. Though she did not speak, her sadness rested plainly in her eyes, and Hades, watching her closely, saw it. He had shown her his throne, his rivers, and the treasures hidden in the deep earth, yet he knew they could never replace the world above. For all his power, he could not give her sunlight. He could not give her the wind that danced in meadows. Still, he wished to comfort her, to offer her something of her own. Quietly, he led her down a narrow path carved through stone, away from the throne room, into a smaller chamber lit by the glow of soft crystals. The ground here was bare, dark soil untouched by roots or bloom. Hades stopped and gestured toward it, his voice finally breaking the silence. He told her this place was hers, a patch of earth untouched and waiting. His words were few, yet they carried a gentleness she had not expected. Persephone looked at the soil, then at him, uncertain at first. But when she knelt and pressed her fingers into the earth, something stirred inside her. It was the same feeling she had always known in the meadows above, the bond between her and the life that longed to grow. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and let her hands rest on the soil. Slowly, shoots of green began to push upward, breaking through the darkness with courage. Leaves unfurled, soft and bright, and soon blossoms followed, their petals glowing faintly in the dim light of the cavern. Colors spread across the patch of earth, reds and blues and soft yellows shining against the black stone. The air filled with the sweet fragrance of new blooms, and for the first time since leaving the world above, Persephone smiled. Hades stood still, his eyes fixed on her as she worked. He had seen many wonders in his eternal reign, but nothing like this. The underworld, long silent and solemn, now held the scent of flowers, the glow of living color, the breath of spring itself. And though he remained silent, there was a shift in his face, a quiet relief as though a weight had lifted. Persephone rose slowly, her hands covered in soil, her cheeks flushed with warmth. She looked around at the blossoms swaying gently in the cavern air and felt her heart steady. Though it was not the meadows of her childhood, it was something she had made, something alive, a reminder that light could grow even in shadow. And in that hidden garden underground, she found a small comfort, a place where her laughter might one day return. The days in the underworld passed in silence, but wherever Persephone went, the silence slowly began to change. Her garden was the first spark of life, a patch of earth that glowed with blossoms in every shade, their fragrance softening the cold stone halls. Yet the magic within her did not stop there. When she left the garden and wandered the caverns, flowers began to appear at her feet, rising out of the dark soil, as if eager to follow her. Small clusters of violets lined her path, White lilies unfurled in the dim glow of crystals, and bright red poppies pushed their way through cracks in the stone. At first, Persephone did not notice. She was lost in thought, her heart still heavy with longing for the meadows above. But when she turned back one day, she gasped softly. Behind her, the trail she had walked was alive with color, each blossom opening as if greeting her with joy. Her eyes widened, and she crouched to touch a violet, its petals glowing faintly as though they held a light of their own. A smile broke across her face, fragile yet true, and she felt her chest grow warm. The underworld, once so still and cold, began to transform around her. Wherever she wandered, the flowers followed. They crept along the rivers of silver, their reflections shimmering in the quiet waters. They climbed up the pillars of black stone, weaving delicate patterns of green and bloom. Even the walls of the caverns began to soften as vines of ivy spread, carrying tiny blossoms that swayed gently in the still air. What had been a land of silence was now touched with whispers of spring, all born from her steps. The spirits of the underworld noticed too. They paused in their wandering, turning their heads to watch her pass, their pale forms lit by the glow of her blossoms. Though they spoke no words, their silence felt less heavy, as though her presence brought them peace. Persephone met their gazes with gentle eyes, and though she did not yet feel at home, she felt less alone. Hades himself watched from a distance at times, his expression unreadable, yet his gaze followed her wherever she walked. He saw how the flowers bloomed for her, how her presence softened even the deepest corners of his realm. Though he did not speak of it, he knew that the underworld was no longer what it had been. She had brought something no treasure, no crown, no throne had ever given him. She had brought life. Persephone's laughter returned slowly, faint at first but growing each day. The caverns answered her with the soft rustle of flowers, and the air no longer felt quite so heavy. Even in the deepest dark, her bloom spread, carrying with it a promise that light could never be fully hidden. Wherever she walked, the underworld itself seemed to sigh in relief, as if it too had long been waiting for her touch. The sun rose and set, yet for Demeter the days blurred into one long ache. She wandered the fields that had once shone with golden grain, calling out her daughter's name until her voice grew hoarse. Persephone did not answer. The meadows where laughter had once filled the air now lay still, the blossoms bending silently under the weight of her absence. Demeter's heart pounded with worry, a constant drum that drove her from village to mountain, from river to sea, searching for any trace of her child. At first, she believed Persephone had wandered farther than usual, chasing flowers into hidden glades. Demeter combed the fields carefully, her hands brushing through tall grasses, her eyes sharp with hope. But as each day passed and no sign appeared, her hope began to crack. The thought that her child might be lost, alone, or taken filled her with a fear she could not silence. She begged the earth to tell her where Persephone had gone, pressing her hands into the soil as if the land itself could whisper the truth. But the ground remained cold and still, holding its secrets close. Villagers tried to comfort her, bringing offerings of bread and fruit, but their kindness could not reach her heart. She barely touched the food, her strength thinning as her grief grew heavier. They told her they had not seen the girl, only remembered the sound of her laughter echoing through the fields days before. Their words were salt on an open wound, reminders of joy now missing. Demeter wept beneath the stars at night, her tears soaking into the earth, and the crops began to wither in sympathy. The world above felt her sorrow. Fields that had once thrived began to fade. Wheat drooped, barley crumbled, and orchards bore no fruit. Farmers raised their hands to the heavens in despair, wondering why the earth had turned against them. But it was not anger that guided Demeter's hand, it was grief. Her sorrow seeped into the soil, and nothing could grow while her heart was broken. She wandered far from her temples, leaving her sacred altars empty. She climbed mountains where the winds howled, calling her daughter's name into the sky. She searched the depths of forests, pushing through tangled roots, praying Persephone might be hiding there. She walked the shores of the sea, her eyes scanning every wave, her voice breaking as she begged the waters to return her child. Still, no answer came. Only silence. Only the ache of absence that grew heavier each day. The earth mirrored her sorrow, its beauty dimmed, its bounty gone. Even the animals grew thin, their cries sharp with hunger. The balance of life faltered, and all who lived upon the earth began to suffer. But Demeter could not stop. She would search until the world itself broke apart if it meant finding Persephone. Her love was too deep, too fierce to allow her to rest. And so she wandered on, her worry endless, her heart refusing to let go of hope, no matter how far she had to go. The world above began to change as Demeter's sorrow deepened. Once golden fields that had stretched across valleys turned pale and brittle, the stalks bending under their own weight before crumbling to dust. Where farmers had once rejoiced at baskets overflowing with grain, now they stared in despair at empty stalks and cracked soil. The earth no longer sang with life, its heartbeat slowed by grief that echoed through every root and every leaf. The rains, too, abandoned the land. Clouds drifted across the sky but held their waters tight, refusing to fall. Rivers thinned until their beds cracked open in the heat, and ponds shrank to small patches of mud where thirsty animals gathered. The songs of birds faded as they flew farther and farther in search of food, leaving the skies eerily quiet. Villages that had once thrived on the gifts of the earth grew tense and hungry, their laughter replaced by whispered prayers that went unanswered. Everywhere, signs of sorrow spread. Fruit trees bore no apples or figs, their branches brittle and bare. Vines withered along the hillsides, their leaves curling into nothing. Even the wildflowers, once bright with Persephone's laughter, closed their faces and fell back into the soil as if mourning alongside Demeter. The balance of life trembled, for when the goddess of harvest grieved, the entire world felt the weight of her pain. The people who lived upon the land tried to care for what little remained. They tilled the soil again and again, searching for signs of growth, but none came. They carried jars to the skies, hoping for rain, but the jars stayed empty. They offered gifts at Demeter's temples, laying out what little bread they could spare. But the goddess was far away, wandering and searching for her daughter. Their cries reached the heavens, yet no relief came. only the silence of withering fields. Children grew thin, their small hands clutching at scraps of food, while parents bowed their heads in helplessness. Animals grew weak, their ribs showing beneath their skin, their once strong calls reduced to faint whimpers. The sorrow of the land was no longer hidden. It was painted across every face, every field, every broken stalk. In the stillness of night, the farmers gathered around their fires, staring into the flames with fear in their hearts. They whispered to one another that the goddess must be angry, that something sacred had been broken. They did not know of her endless search, of the tears she poured into the soil each day, only that their world was dying. The silence of the fields was louder than any storm. It pressed upon the hearts of all who lived, a reminder that the earth itself was grieving. Without Persephone, Demeter's sorrow became the sorrow of the world. And as the days stretched on, without rain, without growth, the people began to wonder if spring would ever return, or if the silence would remain forever. Demeter's feet carried her farther than she had ever wandered before, her heart heavy with grief, and her voice hoarse from calling her daughter's name. She climbed the highest mountains, her cloak catching in the sharp winds, her cries echoing across peaks where no one could answer. The snow that crowned the summits melted beneath her tears, flowing into streams that rushed down the cliffs, but still Persephone did not appear. Demeter's sorrow was carved into every step, and the mountains themselves seemed to bow under her grief. When the peaks gave her no answers, she turned to the seas. She walked the endless shores, her eyes searching the horizon, as if Persephone might rise from the waves. She waded into the water, her arms outstretched, begging the tides to bring her daughter back. The ocean whispered softly, its waves lapping at her knees, but it gave her no comfort. She called out into the endless blue, her voice carried far by the wind, but it returned to her empty, swallowed by the roar of the sea. She crossed valleys where rivers had thinned into trickles, their banks cracked and dry. She searched forests where leaves had withered and fallen early, their branches stretching bare against the sky. In every place she went, she called Persephone's name, her words trembling with desperation, her heart refusing to believe that her child was truly gone. She asked the trees if they had seen her. She asked the winds if they had carried her laughter. She asked the soil if it remembered her footsteps. But none could answer, for the world was silent, bound by the hidden truth that only the shadows beneath the earth knew. The people she passed fell to their knees, begging for her mercy. But Demeter could not stay. She could not think of their suffering, while her own grief consumed her. She moved on, her gaze fixed ahead, her voice calling again and again, Persephone, Persephone, until even the birds grew still to listen. Her journey stretched across lands wide and vast, her body weary yet never stopping. For a mother's love does not rest, and her heart would not allow her to give up. Nights brought no peace. She lay upon the bare earth, her arms wrapped around herself, her dreams filled with memories of her daughter's laughter. Each dawn she rose again, her spirit burning with the need to search, her sorrow spilling into the land so deeply that nothing would grow. It was as though the earth itself mourned with her, echoing her grief across every field and every shore. And so Demeter wandered on, climbing higher, walking farther, calling louder, her voice threading through mountains and seas alike. The world bent beneath her sorrow, but still she did not stop. For she believed that somewhere, somehow, Persephone would hear her, and until that moment came, Demeter would walk the ends of the earth to bring her child back home. The night was deep and heavy when Demeter wandered into a quiet glade, her voice worn from days of calling Persephone's name. The stars above were faint, hidden behind drifting clouds, and the air carried the chill of sorrow. She sank to her knees, pressing her hands into the soil as tears fell once more. Her heart ached so greatly that even the world seemed to dim around her. It was then that a soft glow began to rise at the edge of the trees, pale and gentle, like the flicker of a lantern in the dark. From the shadows stepped Hecate, the goddess of crossroads, keeper of torches and friend to those who wander lost. Her figure was calm and cloaked in twilight, her hands carrying a flame that did not burn, but glowed with steady light. Demeter lifted her weary eyes, and for the first time in many nights, she did not feel alone. Hecate moved closer, her voice low and kind, whispering words that seemed to wrap around Demeter like a cloak of comfort. She spoke of what she had seen, of the day when the earth split open and Persephone vanished into the depths. She told Demeter that she had heard the cries of her daughter as the shadows claimed her, and had seen the black chariot pulled by horses that shone like fire in the night. Though she had not entered the underworld herself, she knew the signs, and her voice trembled with sympathy as she described the sorrow she had witnessed. Demeter's hands clenched tightly in the soil as she listened, her heart torn between anguish and hope. At last, there was truth. At last, someone who had seen what had happened. She begged Hecate to tell her where Persephone had gone, to lead her to the place where her daughter had been taken. Hecate placed a gentle hand upon her shoulder and promised that she would not let her face the darkness alone. She would guide her, she would walk beside her, and together they would seek the answers hidden in the depths of the world. The flame in Hecate's torch burned brighter, casting long shadows across the trees. Her presence carried a strength that soothed Demeter's breaking heart, for in her voice there was no false comfort, only honesty and a path forward. She told Demeter that the sun itself had seen what had happened, for nothing on the earth could escape its gaze, and that it was to Helios they must turn for the truth. Demeter rose slowly, her body weary but her spirit reignited with purpose. She held tightly to Hecate's words, her grief sharpened into determination. No longer would she wander aimlessly through mountains and seas. With Hecate at her side, she would seek the one who could reveal all. And so the two goddesses walked together into the fading night, their footsteps guided by the torch's glow. For the first time since her daughter's disappearance, Demeter's path no longer felt empty. Hecate's guidance was a thread of hope in the darkness, and though the journey ahead would be long, she knew now she was not alone. The dawn came slowly as Demeter and Hecate climbed the hills to seek the one who sees all things. The air was still cool, the sky brushed with pale colors, and the first rays of light stretched across the land. Demeter's heart pounded with both fear and hope, for she knew that if anyone had witnessed the fate of her daughter, It would be Helios, the sun who rides across the sky each day with unblinking eyes. As the light grew stronger, the figure of Helios emerged, rising with his blazing chariot, his horses carrying fire in their manes. His glow was so fierce that Demeter shielded her eyes, though she refused to turn away. She called out to him, her voice trembling with desperation, asking if he had seen her child. The air shimmered as Helios slowed his chariot, his radiant form towering above, his gaze steady and filled with the weight of all he had witnessed. Demeter's grief poured out as she begged for truth, her words spilling like water from a broken vessel. She spoke of her endless search, of the sorrow that had withered the earth, and of the silence that echoed in her heart. Helios listened with patience, the flames of his horses flickering gently as though even they felt her pain. Then at last, in a voice deep and steady, he revealed what he had seen. He told her that Persephone had been taken by Hades, the lord of the Underworld, who had risen from the earth in his black chariot. He had seen the ground split open, had seen the girl's frightened face as she was drawn into the shadows. The sun had watched her cries fade as the chariot carried her below, the meadow closing behind them as though it had swallowed its secret. Helios spoke without cruelty, but his words burned with truth, leaving no space for doubt. Demeter's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her hands pressed into the earth as if to keep herself from breaking apart. Hecate bent beside her, steadying her with quiet strength, but her heart felt as though it had been torn open. To know her daughter lived but was lost to the realm of shadows was a pain sharper than any she had known. The fields she once tended seemed to vanish from her mind, replaced only by the image of Persephone in the chariot of darkness. Still, Helios did not leave her in despair. His voice softened, and he told her that all was not lost. Persephone lived, though far below, and her fate was not yet sealed. The path would be hard, the struggle fierce, but there was still hope if she sought the counsel of the gods. Demeter lifted her head, her tear-streaked face lit by the glow of the rising sun. The truth was bitter, but it was truth at last, and truth gave her direction. She rose slowly, her grief tempered by determination. Persephone had been taken, but she was not gone. With Hecate at her side and the words of Helios to guide her, Demeter vowed she would not rest until her daughter was returned. Demeter's sorrow turned to fire once the truth from Helios settled in her heart. Her daughter had not wandered away, nor had she been lost to chance. She had been taken, drawn into the shadows by Hades, and this was something Demeter could not forgive. Her grief, once silent and aching, now burned with anger so fierce that the world above trembled beneath her steps. She returned to the fields she once loved, but she no longer tended them with gentle care. Where her hands had once coaxed wheat to rise and flowers to bloom, now she withheld her blessing. Seeds lay in the soil but did not sprout. Buds formed but withered before they opened, and orchards stood barren, as if winter had stolen their breath. The land reflected her fury, turning dry and empty, a mirror of her broken heart. The skies too seemed to mourn. Clouds gathered but gave no rain, their heavy forms drifting without release. Rivers slowed to a crawl, their waters thin and weak, while the earth cracked under the weight of famine. Animals roamed in vain for food, their cries sharp and sorrowful, and humans lifted their eyes to the heavens in despair. They prayed at Demeter's altars, begging for her mercy, but she turned away. No offering, no plea could reach her, not until her daughter was returned. Word spread quickly among the gods of Olympus. They watched as the mortal world withered, their temples growing quiet as the people weakened. For though the gods thrived on offerings and prayers, none could come from starving hands. The great halls of Olympus began to feel the hunger of the earth, and whispers grew louder. All knew that Demeter's grief had become wrath, and that unless Persephone was returned, the world itself would fall into ruin. Demeter stood tall in her anger, unyielding as the mountains. She sent no message of apology, no hint of forgiveness. She called out to the heavens themselves, demanding her child back from the depths below. Her voice rang like thunder across valleys and seas, declaring that she would allow no harvest, no fruit, no green to touch the land until Persephone was restored to her. She would rather see the world starve than see her daughter lost to darkness. The gods argued among themselves, their voices clashing like storms, but none could deny the truth. The earth was dying, and only Demeter held the key to its life. Zeus, the ruler of the skies, felt the weight of her fury most of all. He knew her power, knew that no god could force the earth to bloom without her will, and so her anger became the world's burden, a storm none could escape. In the silence that followed, the land lay barren and cold. Crops remained still, rivers shallow, skies empty. The world waited, just as Demeter waited, her heart set with fire. She would not bend, she would not yield. Until Persephone was returned to her, there would be no spring. High above the mortal world, where the peaks of Olympus touched the sky, the gods gathered in solemn council. Their golden thrones gleamed in the light of an eternal sun, yet there was no joy in their meeting. The air itself seemed heavy, filled with the weight of mortal prayers that had grown thin and desperate. From below, the smoke of empty altars curled weakly toward the heavens, carrying with it the silence of villages that had once thrived. The earth was starving, and even the immortals could feel its pain. Zeus sat at the center, his throne towering, his face stern as storm clouds. Lightning flickered faintly around his brow, though his voice was quiet when he spoke. He reminded the council that Demeter's sorrow had grown into wrath, and that she had sealed the fate of the earth with her refusal to let anything grow. Without Persephone, she would not yield, and the world itself would crumble into ruin. His words echoed across the marble hall, and every god present knew them to be true. Hera, her voice sharp as a blade, spoke of the suffering of the people below. Without their offerings, the temples of Olympus grew quiet, their fires dimmed. Poseidon, restless as the sea, rumbled that even the waters felt the grief of the land. Rivers dried, and the oceans knew no bounty. Athena, wise and calm, urged that justice must be sought, for no balance could be kept if one goddess's grief was allowed to drown the world. Apollo, shining with the light of truth, added that Helios had seen the taking of Persephone, and there could be no denial of what had been done. But when Hades' name was spoken, silence spread like a shadow. The god shifted uneasily, for though he ruled apart in the underworld, his power was great, and his authority as unyielding as any of theirs. None wished to provoke his anger, yet none could ignore the ruins spreading across the earth. It was Hermes, swift and clever, who broke the silence. His voice was smooth as flowing water, as he suggested that perhaps words, not weapons, could solve what grief and anger had torn apart. He offered to go below, to carry a message to the dark god, for no place was closed to him and no path too shadowed for his feet. Zeus leaned back, his hand tightening around the arm of his throne. His gaze drifted across the council, weighing the words of his kin, the cries of mortals, and the fury of Demeter. At last he spoke, his voice like rolling thunder, declaring that Persephone must be returned, for the earth could not be left to die. The council agreed, their voices rising as one, though each carried unease in their hearts. And so it was decided. Hermes would descend to the realm below, swift as the wind, to speak with Hades and seek the return of the daughter who had been taken. The council ended not with celebration, but with resolve, the gods watching the horizon with anxious eyes, for they knew the fate of mortals and gods alike rested in the choice that lay beneath the earth. When the council of Olympus ended, all eyes turned to Hermes, the messenger of the gods. His sandals shimmered with golden wings, and his staff gleamed faintly as if already eager to begin the journey. Known for his swiftness and his kindness, Hermes alone could travel freely between worlds, touching both the heights of the heavens and the depths of the underworld without fear. He bowed respectfully to Zeus, who gave him the command to bring word to Hades, to remind him that the earth was dying, and to demand that Persephone be returned to her mother. Without delay, Hermes leapt into the sky, his sandals carrying him like a breeze across the clouds. He moved faster than any bird, swifter than the wind, his cloak rippling behind him as he descended toward the mortal world. Below, he saw the barren fields, the cracked rivers, and the sorrow etched into the faces of people who no longer sang as they worked. The silence weighed heavily on the land, and Hermes' heart grew heavy as well. He quickened his pace, knowing the suffering could not last much longer without breaking everything apart. At the place where the fissure had once opened, Hermes hovered, his eyes narrowing as he found the path that led below. With ease, he stepped into the shadows, his sandals lighting the way as he descended into the hidden realm. The air grew cooler, and the faint glow of crystals shimmered against the cavern walls. The silence of the underworld greeted him, heavy and eternal, yet it did not frighten him. Hermes moved with confidence, his steps light, his staff tapping gently against the stone. As he passed along the silver rivers and beneath the trees with their glowing leaves, he marveled at the beauty Persephone had already brought to the realm. Blossoms bloomed where her feet had touched, and even the air carried a hint of fragrance, softening the solemn stillness of the underworld. Hermes smiled faintly, knowing this was proof that Persephone's spirit had not been broken, even here in the shadows. Finally, he reached the great hall where Hades sat upon his throne of obsidian. The dark god lifted his gaze as Hermes entered, his eyes steady, his presence vast as the cavern itself. The horses of his chariot stamped softly nearby, their fiery eyes watching with quiet intensity. Hermes bowed, his movements respectful but unafraid, and raised his staff in greeting. He spoke not with sharpness, but with calm, reminding Hades that Demeter's grief had spread across the earth, that mortals starved and rivers dried because the goddess of harvest would not let life bloom without her daughter. He told him the council of Olympus had met, and that the will of Zeus was clear. Persephone must return, or the world above would perish. The words echoed through the hall, steady and certain, carried on the voice of a god who bore no malice but only truth. Hermes stood tall, his wings folded, his eyes meeting Hades with unwavering calm. The message had been delivered, and the choice now rested in the silence of the underworld. Hermes stood before the throne, his staff in hand, his golden wings glinting faintly in the dim glow of the cavern. The air was thick with silence, and Hades sat in stillness, his dark crown catching the light of hidden fires. His gaze was steady, unblinking, as he regarded the messenger who had come from Olympus. For a long moment neither spoke, the weight of the underworld pressing around them. Then Hermes, with a voice both calm and kind, began to explain. He spoke first of Demeter, of the endless miles she had walked across mountains and seas, calling her daughter's name into the empty air. He described the way her tears had soaked the soil, how her grief had spilled into the land until nothing could grow. He told of the farmers who bent over cracked fields, their baskets empty, their prayers rising to the heavens unanswered. He painted the image of children whose laughter had faded into hunger, of rivers that had dried to dust, of birds that had flown away because the earth could no longer feed them. His words carried no anger, only truth, spoken with the soft weight of compassion. Hades did not interrupt. He listened in silence, his face unreadable, though his hands tightened faintly on the arms of his throne. Hermes continued, telling him that the sorrow of one mother had become the sorrow of the world, that the grief of Demeter was now the grief of all who lived. He reminded him that no god, no matter how powerful, could thrive if the earth itself was broken. The world depended on balance, and balance had been shattered the day Persephone was taken. The messenger's voice grew softer, more like a plea than a command. He told Hades that Demeter's love for her daughter was unshakable, that no threat and no gift could silence it. She would not allow the world to flourish until Persephone was returned, and if the earth perished, so too would the worship and offerings of mortals. Even Olympus would suffer. Hermes bowed his head slightly, his tone gentle but firm, urging Hades to see that the cost of keeping Persephone was too great, not only for Demeter, but for the whole world. Hades sat motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the floor before lifting again to meet Hermes' steady gaze. Though his face remained stern, there was a flicker in his expression, a shadow of thought that betrayed the storm within him. He had not wanted to harm the world above. He had only sought to fill the emptiness of his own. But now, the weight of what his choice had caused pressed upon him, like the cavern walls themselves. Hermes fell silent at last, his staff lowered, his words lingering in the vast hall like a soft echo. The plea had been made, not with threats, but with truth, not with harshness, but with kindness. The underworld was quiet once more, and all that remained was Hades' answer, one that could change the fate of gods and mortals alike. The words of Hermes lingered in the great hall, long after his voice had fallen silent. Hades sat upon his throne of black stone, his figure tall and unyielding, yet his thoughts churned like a storm beneath the surface. His realm was quiet as always, the silver rivers flowing softly, the glow of hidden gems casting faint light against the cavern walls. But within him, there was no calm. He stared into the shadows, hearing the echoes of Demeter's sorrow carried through the messenger's plea. He had not sought to bring ruin to the earth. His desire had not been born of cruelty, but of loneliness. For countless ages he had ruled in silence, his only company, the spirits that wandered his halls, their voices faint and distant. When he had seen Persephone in the golden fields, bright with laughter and light, something in him had stirred that he had not felt in an eternity. He had longed not for power, for he already ruled an endless kingdom, but for a presence to share it with. And now, though she was by his side, the world above was breaking beneath the weight of her absence. Hades leaned forward, his hands resting heavily on his knees. He imagined the fields withering, the rivers running dry, the mortals suffering with hollow eyes and empty stomachs. He imagined the silence that would spread if Demeter's grief was left unheeded, a silence greater than even the one in his realm. He had no wish to see the living world crumble. Though he had taken Persephone out of longing, he could not deny that her mother's pain echoed louder than his own loneliness. Hermes waited patiently, his expression calm, his staff gleaming faintly in the dim light. He did not press further, for he knew the weight of such a choice could not be rushed. Hades' gaze flickered to the garden Persephone had grown, a patch of color blooming in the shadowed world. Flowers glowed softly there, their fragrance weaving gently through the halls. They were proof that Persephone had brought life into his domain, proof that she belonged not only to the world above, but also to the underworld. His chest tightened with conflict. To let her go would be to return to the silence he had always known, to watch his halls darken again into endless shadow. Yet to keep her would be to doom the earth to death, to starve mortals and leave Olympus without its worship. He did not wish for either fate, but the choice pressed against him like stone closing in on every side. At last, Hades closed his eyes, the crown upon his head gleaming faintly in the cavern light. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady, though sorrow lingered deep within. He did not speak, not yet, but his hesitation revealed the truth. For all his sternness, he did not wish to see the world die. And though his heart clung to Persephone, he knew that the time for a decision was fast approaching. Persephone walked slowly through the garden she had created, her fingers brushing the petals of blossoms that glowed faintly in the dim light. The flowers swayed gently, as if reaching toward her, their colors a reminder of the meadows she had once called home. Yet though she smiled at their beauty, her heart ached with confusion. Each day she thought of her mother, of the warmth of sunlight and the sound of birdsong. But each day she also found herself growing used to the silence of the underworld. It was not only shadows here. There was a stillness that calmed her, and in that stillness she had found a strange kind of belonging. She knelt by the silver river, watching her reflection ripple in the glowing water. Who was she now, she wondered? Was she still the daughter who laughed among wildflowers, or was she becoming something more? Something tied to the earth below, as much as the world above. Her heart pulled her in two directions, leaving her restless, caught between longing and curiosity. At times, she walked with Hades, silent but steady beside her. He did not command her, nor did he bind her in chains. He showed her his kingdom, vast and endless, filled with treasures hidden far from the eyes of mortals. She could see the loneliness in his gaze, though he never spoke of it, and she felt both sorrow and compassion for him. She did not hate him, for he had given her the soil where her flowers bloomed and had listened in quiet when she spoke. And yet, in the stillness of night, her dreams carried her back to her mother's embrace, to the warmth of fields drenched in sunlight. The spirits of the underworld drifted quietly through the halls, their pale forms bowing as they passed her. They seemed comforted by her presence, as though her flowers and her light softened their endless wandering. Persephone felt a tenderness for them, as if her being there gave them a glimpse of peace. She wondered if this too was part of her place, if she was meant to bring comfort where none had been before. Still, her heart ached for Demeter. She knew her mother must be searching, her grief pressing into the earth until it withered. Persephone felt it in her bones, the pull of her mother's sorrow reaching even into the shadows. Could she remain here and allow her mother's heart to break? Could she leave and abandon the flowers she had nurtured below? Persephone rose, her reflection fading in the river as she turned back to her garden. She stood between two worlds, both calling to her, both claiming pieces of her heart. Above, sunlight and her mother's love waited. Below, shadows and the quiet bloom of her own strength called to her. She closed her eyes, torn and trembling, knowing that whichever path she chose, she would never again be only what she once was. Persephone stood at the edge of the garden, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her time in the underworld was drawing to an end. Word had reached her that her mother's sorrow had brought famine upon the earth, and that the gods themselves had gathered to demand her return. She felt the pull of her mother's love, like sunlight calling from far away. And yet the shadows of the underworld clung to her, as though they, too, had laid claim to her heart. She was torn, restless, and uncertain, her steps carrying her back and forth between the blossoms she had grown and the path that led away from them. Hades appeared beside her, silent as always, his dark eyes fixed not on his throne, but on her. He did not command her to stay. Though his face betrayed a sadness, he did not speak aloud. Instead, he offered her a single fruit, its skin deep and red, glowing faintly in the dim light of the cavern. It was a pomegranate, heavy in her hands, its surface cool and smooth. Persephone looked down at it, her chest tightening. She knew the stories of sacred fruit, knew that eating in the land of the dead could bind her to its soil. Yet in that moment, she felt the weight of choice pressing against her. To leave without a trace of this place felt impossible, for she had walked its caverns, touched its rivers, and brought life where there had been none. It had changed her as much as she had changed it. Her lips trembled as she turned the fruit in her palms, its ruby skin shining like a heart beating quietly in the shadows. Slowly, she broke it open. The seeds within gleamed like drops of blood, bright against the pale stone around her. She lifted one to her lips, tasting its sweetness. It burst upon her tongue, filling her mouth with rich flavor, both bitter and sweet. She swallowed, then reached for another, and another still. By the time she stopped, 6 ruby seeds had passed her lips, each one tying her more deeply to the underworld than she could see in that moment. Hades watched silently, his face solemn, though a flicker of something unreadable stirred in his gaze. Perhaps it was sorrow, perhaps relief, perhaps the quiet recognition that she had chosen, even if she did not yet understand what that choice meant. Persephone lowered the empty fruit, her heart unsettled but strangely steady. She felt both lighter and heavier, as if the seeds had woven threads inside her that bound her to 2 worlds at once. The flowers in her garden swayed softly, the silver river murmured faintly, and the air seemed to grow still, as though the underworld itself recognized what had been done. Persephone did not speak, but deep inside she knew. She could leave, but she could never truly leave. The taste of the ruby seeds would remain with her forever, a promise etched into her soul that she belonged not only to the light above, but also to the shadows below. The silence in the cavern deepened after Persephone ate the seeds, as though the underworld itself had paused to listen. The taste of the pomegranate lingered on her lips, sweet and sharp, a flavor that seemed to echo inside her long after the fruit was gone. She felt different, though she could not yet name why. Her heart pounded, her breath unsteady, and when she looked up at Hades, his eyes held a knowledge she had not yet grasped. In the halls of the underworld, there were laws older than any throne, older even than the gods who ruled. To eat the food of this realm was to tie oneself to it, to bind one's soul with threads that could not be broken. Persephone, in tasting the seeds, had unknowingly sealed her fate. She might return to the world above, but she would never be free from the call of the shadows below. The seeds were not only fruit, they were promise, binding her to return each year to the realm where she had walked among rivers of silver and gardens of her own making. Hades stepped closer, his voice low, calm, carrying the weight of truth. He told her gently that the choice she had made was now part of her forever. She could leave, yes, for her mother's love, and the cries of the earth demanded it. But because she had tasted the fruit of his kingdom, she would return, drawn back as surely as the tides follow the moon. Persephone listened, her heart trembling with both fear and understanding. She had not meant to make such a choice, yet she could not deny that she had done so. Her gaze drifted to the blossoms in her garden, the flowers swaying faintly as if nodding to this new truth. She thought of her mother, who even now must be searching still, her sorrow weighing heavily upon the world above. She longed to see her again, to feel her arms around her, to walk once more among the golden fields. But another part of her, quiet and unspoken, knew she could not abandon this place entirely. She had planted roots here, however small, and the seeds within her had tied her to them. Hermes, who had watched silently, bowed his head, for he too knew the laws of the underworld. There was no undoing what had been done. He turned to Persephone with a look of sympathy, yet he did not speak, for there was nothing to soften such truth. Persephone's lips pressed together, her thoughts heavy, her heart caught between sorrow and acceptance. The law of the underworld had been written the moment the seeds touched her tongue. It was not cruel, only unyielding, like the earth itself. Each year she would rise to her mother's embrace, and each year she would return to the realm of shadows. Her fate was no longer bound to one world, but to two. And from this choice, the cycle of seasons would be born, a story of balance, written into the heart of the earth forever. The earth above lay in sorrow, its fields cracked and barren, its rivers little more than fading streams. Yet on the day Persephone returned, a change stirred in the air, faint but undeniable. The clouds parted, letting through rays of golden light that touched the land like a long-forgotten promise. Demeter, weary from her endless searching, stood upon a lonely hill when she saw her daughter at last, walking toward her with the glow of life still in her eyes. In that moment, Demeter's breath caught, and the world itself seemed to pause. She rushed forward, her arms outstretched, her voice breaking with joy as she called Persephone's name. Persephone too quickened her steps, her heart bursting with longing, and when at last they reached one another, they fell into an embrace so fierce it seemed the heavens themselves trembled. Demeter held her daughter close, tears streaming down her face, her hands clinging as though she would never let go again. Persephone buried her face against her mother's shoulder, her arms wrapping tightly around her. She breathed in the scent of wheat and blossoms, the familiar warmth that she had missed so deeply. Tears filled her eyes too, for she had feared she might never again feel this embrace. The fields around them seemed to stir at the strength of their reunion. Grass pushed through the dry earth, blossoms lifted their faces to the sun, and the sound of birds returned to the sky. Demeter pulled back just enough to look into Persephone's eyes, brushing hair from her face with trembling fingers. She kissed her forehead again and again, unable to stop herself, as though each kiss could make up for the days of absence. Her voice broke as she asked if Persephone was safe, if she had suffered, her words tumbling in a flood of relief and fear. Persephone, still holding her mother's hands, nodded softly. She told her of the underworld, of the garden she had grown there, of the silence that had been both heavy and beautiful. She did not speak of every detail, not yet, but she let her mother know she had been treated with care. Demeter's tears flowed freely, but her heart swelled with joy at the sight of her daughter alive, returned to her arms. She vowed then and there never to let her wander so far again, to keep her close where no shadow could reach her. Yet as they held each other, Persephone felt the quiet weight of the seeds within her. She knew this joy, as fierce as it was, could not last unbroken. Still, she did not speak of it. Not yet. Not while her mother's arms were wrapped around her in warmth she had longed for through every night in the shadows. The world rejoiced with them. Trees blossomed, fields turned green, and the scent of fruit filled the air once more. It was as if the earth itself had wept alongside Demeter, and now sang in relief. For a time, there was no famine, no sorrow, only the joy of a mother and daughter reunited at last, their love strong enough to awaken spring from the deepest winter. The moment Persephone returned to her mother's arms, the earth itself stirred as though waking from a long and troubled sleep. The soil, dry and cracked for so many months, softened beneath the touch of Demeter's joy. From its depths, green shoots pushed upward, eager to feel the warmth of the sun once more. Fields that had lain bare now shimmered with new life. The promise of harvest stretching across the horizon like a golden dream reborn. Flowers burst from the meadows, their petals unfurling in colors so bright they seemed to paint the world anew. Daisies and violets spread across the hillsides. Lilies rose in tall clusters, and red poppies swayed in the gentle breeze. Their fragrance filled the air, sweet and strong, as if the land itself were sighing with relief. The wild bees returned, buzzing joyfully among the blossoms, and butterflies danced above them, their wings glimmering in the sunlight. The rivers, too, reawakened. Where once their beds had been cracked and lifeless, waters now flowed swiftly, silver and clear. They carried the songs of spring down valleys and through forests, their voices mingling with the laughter of birds that had returned to fill the skies. Fish darted in and out of the streams, their scales catching the light, while frogs croaked happily at the edges of ponds that were full once again. The sound of water rushing against stones echoed across the land, a hymn of renewal that reached even the smallest village. The sky itself seemed transformed. The heavy, unmoving clouds broke apart, letting through the pure blue that had been hidden for too long. The sun shone brightly, its warmth spilling over fields and forests, bringing life back to every leaf and blade of grass. Breezes carried the scent of blossoms across the earth, and the air felt lighter, as though every breath was filled with hope. Even the stars at night twinkled more brightly, their reflections dancing in the rivers below. Villagers stepped out of their homes, their weary faces lifting to the sky in wonder. They watched as crops began to rise again in their fields, as orchards filled with new buds, as the once barren earth returned its gifts. Joy spread through their voices as they sang songs of gratitude, offering prayers at Demeter's temples, their hearts swelling with relief. Children ran through the meadows, gathering flowers and laughing once more, their hunger replaced by the sweetness of fruit and bread. Demeter walked among the fields, her hand brushing the grain that now swayed in tall, golden waves. Her face, though still marked by the sorrow she had endured, now shone with a radiant smile, for Persephone was with her, and the earth was alive again. Persephone herself knelt in the grass, her fingers trailing through blossoms that opened eagerly at her touch. Together, mother and daughter breathed life back into the world, and for a time, the earth was filled with a joy so great that it seemed nothing could ever disturb its peace again. Spring swept across the land like a song, carrying joy to every corner of the earth. The air was filled with warmth once more, gentle winds drifting through blossoming trees, scattering petals that fluttered down like soft rain. Meadows bloomed in dazzling colors, stretching endlessly as if the earth itself had dressed in celebration. Each flower seemed to lift its face toward the sun, rejoicing in the return of Persephone, whose very presence brought life back to the world. Birds filled the skies with their music, their voices weaving together into melodies that echoed through valleys and forests. They built their nests in branches heavy with blossoms, their wings glinting in the sunlight as they darted joyfully across the fields. Bees hummed busily from flower to flower, and butterflies painted the air with their delicate wings. Everywhere life stirred, renewed by the touch of spring. Villagers stepped outside their homes with wonder shining in their eyes. They had feared the world might remain barren forever, but now their fields were alive with sprouting grain, and orchards promised heavy branches of fruit. They gathered together, laughing and singing, their voices carrying far as they thanked Demeter for her blessings and celebrated the return of her daughter. Children wove garlands of daisies and lilies, placing them on their heads as they danced in circles, their joy as pure as the sunlight spilling across the earth. The forests, too, awakened in celebration. Trees that had stood bare through long months now rustled with new leaves, their branches bending under the weight of blossoms and buds. Deer stepped cautiously into the open fields, grazing on the tender shoots, while rabbits hopped through the tall grasses. Even the rivers seemed to sing as they tumbled over stones, their waters bright and alive. Persephone walked through the meadows with her mother at her side, her hands brushing the blossoms that opened wider at her touch. Everywhere she went, colors deepened and fragrances grew sweeter, as though the earth itself was rejoicing in her return. Demeter's face glowed with pride and relief, her heart full as she watched her daughter bring beauty and renewal wherever she stepped. Festivals rose in the villages as people honored the season of abundance. Fires were lit in celebration, and tables filled with bread, fruit, and flowers were laid out in gratitude. Songs were sung late into the night, voices raised to the heavens in praise of the goddess who had restored life to the earth and her daughter who carried the spirit of spring itself. The joy of spring was more than beauty, it was a promise. It reminded the world that after sorrow, there could be renewal, that even the longest winter would always end. And as Persephone laughed among the blossoms, her smile bright as the morning sun, the earth rejoiced with her. For in her return, life had been restored, and spring had become not only a season, but a celebration of love that could never be broken. The days grew longer, and the sun lingered in the sky, as if it too wished to share in the joy of Persephone's return. Warmth settled across the earth, filling every field, forest, and meadow with life. The breath of spring softened into the steady glow of summer, and under Demeter's careful watch, the crops began to flourish once more. Golden waves of wheat rose tall across the plains, bending gently in the breeze like a sea of sunlight. Barley shimmered in silver hues, while orchards filled with fruit so heavy that branches bowed beneath their weight. Vines stretched across hillsides, thick with clusters of grapes, their skins glistening like jewels. In the warmth, everywhere, the earth offered its gifts freely, and the people rejoiced at the abundance that returned to their tables. Demeter walked among the fields with quiet pride, her hands brushing lightly against the stalks, as if blessing them with each touch. She had suffered, and her sorrow had shaken the world. But with her daughter beside her once more, her heart swelled with peace. Her joy poured into the soil, filling it with strength, and the land responded in kind. Seeds sprouted with ease, rain fell softly when needed, and sunlight kissed the earth in perfect measure. It was as though the world itself leaned close to honor the bond between mother and child. Persephone joined her, laughter bubbling as she moved through the orchards and meadows. Children of the villages often followed her, bringing baskets to collect flowers and fruit that seemed brighter and sweeter in her presence. She crowned them with blossoms, their smiles lighting up the summer days, and their laughter carried across the fields like a song. For the people, she was more than the goddess of spring. She was hope itself, living proof that life could return after loss. The rivers flowed full and strong, sparkling in the summer sun, their waters carrying cool relief to the land. Birds nested in the tall grasses, their calls weaving together into melodies that filled the air. The hum of bees was steady, their hives heavy with honey, while deer grazed lazily in the shade of trees heavy with ripening fruit. Life thrived everywhere, woven together in harmony, as if the entire earth was sighing in gratitude for the care it once feared had been lost. Even in Olympus, the gods looked upon the thriving earth with satisfaction. Offerings returned to their temples, fires burned bright on their altars, and songs of thanks rose from villages far and wide. Yet for Demeter, no offering mattered more than the simple truth that her daughter walked again at her side. Summer spread across the world like a golden cloak, its warmth steady and full of promise. Under Demeter's renewed care, the earth flourished, and the people knew peace. They feasted, they danced, and they rested in the glow of abundance, never doubting that the goddess of harvest and her daughter would keep the world alive with their love. As summer slowly faded, a subtle change touched the air. The days grew shorter, the light of the sun softened, and a cool breeze began to slip through the fields. Leaves on the trees shifted from green to shades of amber and gold, their edges tinged with the promise of autumn. The earth seemed to grow quieter, as though it knew what was coming, as though it was bracing itself for a farewell it could not stop. Persephone felt it too. Deep within her, the memory of the 6 ruby seeds stirred, pulling her gently toward the shadows she could not escape. She walked through the meadows one last time, her fingers brushing against the tall grasses and flowers that bent toward her as if they did not want her to leave. Each petal, each blade of grass seemed to cling to her presence, unwilling to let go of the warmth she carried. Demeter walked beside her, her smile faint and heavy with unspoken sorrow. She had cherished every moment of their time together, each laugh, each glance, each shared breath of sunlight. But she knew the law of the underworld could not be broken. Her daughter could not remain forever. Demeter's heart ached, her hands clutching Persephone's as though holding tighter could change the fate already written. The people too felt the shift. Though their fields were still heavy with grain and their tables full of fruit, they noticed the cooling air, the earlier sunsets, and the faint hush falling over the earth. They whispered prayers at Demeter's temples, asking for the warmth to last, fearing the coming stillness. Yet they did not know the deeper truth, that their bounty was tied to a bond between mother and daughter, to the path Persephone now prepared to take. On the final evening, Demeter and Persephone stood together in the fading light. The sky glowed with soft oranges and purples, and the air carried the crisp scent of leaves ready to fall. Persephone leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, her eyes closed as she tried to memorize the feeling of her embrace, the sound of her heartbeat, the warmth of her touch. She whispered promises of her return, her voice trembling but steady with love. Demeter pressed her lips to her daughter's hair, her tears falling silently. She wished she could fight the law, wished she could keep her child forever in her arms, but she knew the world required balance, and that balance came at the cost of her joy. Yet even in sorrow, she found comfort in the promise that Persephone would rise again, that spring would always follow the cold. When the time came, Persephone stepped back slowly, her hand slipping from her mother's grasp. The air grew still, the earth quiet, and the first true chill of autumn swept across the fields. With her heart torn but resolute, Persephone prepared to return to the shadows below, leaving behind the warmth of summer, carrying with her the promise that light would return when the earth was ready to wake again. Autumn drifted across the land like a gentle sigh, carrying with it the quiet knowledge that change had come again. The once bright green leaves turned to gold, copper, and crimson, glowing like embers in the fading sunlight. Slowly they let go of their branches, spinning softly through the air before settling on the earth below. Each falling leaf was a whisper of farewell, a reminder that Persephone had returned to the underworld, and that the world above must now learn to wait. The fields, once alive with the hum of summer, grew still. The harvest had been gathered, the barns filled, and the farmers' hands rested from their labor. Yet though their stores were heavy, their hearts felt the weight of the season's change. The songs that had once risen in joy now softened into quiet hymns of gratitude and longing, for they knew that winter lingered close behind. The skies mirrored the earth's transformation. The bright blue of summer faded into pale grays, and the sun, once bold and strong, sank lower each day. Mornings carried a sharp chill, and evenings arrived with shadows that stretched long across the fields. Birds gathered in flocks, their wings darkening the sky as they flew south, leaving behind silence in the branches where they had once sung. Demeter walked through the quieting fields, her face solemn but steady. She touched the soil gently, blessing what remained, though her heart ached with the absence of her daughter. She felt the emptiness where Persephone's laughter once rang, but she also carried the promise that spring would come again. She knew this cycle now, understood that her joy and her sorrow were bound together in a rhythm that even the gods could not undo. The people prepared for the colder days, gathering wood, mending their homes, and storing food for the long nights ahead. They moved with calm acceptance, for they too had learned the pattern of the seasons. Just as flowers must sleep before they bloom again, so too must the land grow quiet before life returned. And so they worked with hope in their hearts, trusting that Persephone's return would bring spring once more. The forests grew hushed as the last of the leaves fell, carpeting the earth in shades of amber and brown. Streams slowed, their waters colder now, their voices softer as they moved beneath the weight of autumn's end. The air smelled of smoke from village fires, and the wind carried with it a stillness that stretched across hills and valleys alike. Autumn faded gently, like the closing of a beloved book, its final pages filled with both beauty and melancholy. The land grew quiet, waiting for the sleep of winter, waiting for the moment when Persephone would rise again. Until then, the world held its breath, wrapped in silence and memory, carrying the soft echo of laughter that promised to return when the earth was ready to bloom once more. Winter settled gently over the world, draping the land in silence. Snow fell across the fields, soft and steady, covering the earth in a blanket of white. The trees stood bare against the pale sky, their branches etched like dark lines in a painting of stillness. Rivers slowed beneath sheets of ice, and the air carried a crisp chill that whispered of sleep. The earth was not dead, only resting, waiting for the warmth of spring to return. Far below, in the shadowed halls of the Underworld, Persephone sat beside Hades. The firelight flickered across the stone walls, casting soft glows that danced upon their faces. The world above may have been cold, but here, deep within the earth, there was a quiet warmth, a steady calm that wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. Persephone's flowers had withered in her absence, their blooms fading back into the soil, but her garden remained, its dark earth waiting patiently for her return in the seasons to come. She often thought of her mother, picturing Demeter's hands brushing the snow from the fields, her face marked with longing. Persephone's heart ached at the thought, yet she understood now that this was the rhythm of their bond. Her presence above brought life, her absence brought rest, and together these cycles created the heartbeat of the earth. It was a truth she had come to accept, though it still filled her with sorrow each time the shadows closed around her. Hades sat quietly at her side, his presence steady as stone. Though he spoke little, there was a gentleness in the way his eyes softened when they fell upon her. He did not seek to replace the world she had left, but he gave her space to find her place in his realm. In his company, she found a strange comfort, not of sunlight and laughter, but of stillness and understanding. They were two souls bound by solitude, yet their silence together grew less heavy than silence alone. Above them, the earth rested. Farmers stayed close to their hearths, their barns filled with the harvest gathered before autumn's end. Children played in the snow, their laughter breaking the still air, while animals slept deep in burrows and dens. Fires burned brightly in the villages, warming hearts through the long nights, and though the land was quiet, hope lingered. For all knew that winter was not forever, that beneath the frozen soil, seeds were sleeping, waiting for Persephone's return. As the nights stretched long and the days remained pale, Persephone leaned against the throne, her eyes drifting closed, her thoughts filled with dreams of fields in bloom. Hades watched, his hand resting lightly upon the arm of his seat, his face calm as the river of shadows flowed beyond them. Together they waited, bound by the cycle that joined them to the earth above. Winter's sleep was deep, but within it stirred the promise of awakening, a reminder that spring always followed, and that love could never be silenced, not even by the longest night. The gods of Olympus gathered once more, their thrones gleaming in the high halls, their eyes watching the earth below. They had seen the sorrow that had come when Persephone was taken. They had seen the joy that returned with her, and they had seen the quiet balance restored when she moved between the two worlds. It was in this rhythm that they understood a new truth. one that would forever bind the cycles of nature to her steps. Zeus spoke with the strength of thunder, his voice carrying across the council. He declared that the earth could not exist in endless summer, nor could it survive in endless winter. It needed both life and rest, both growth and stillness. The comings and goings of Persephone would ensure this balance, for in her return to Demeter, the fields would bloom, and in her descent to Hades, the earth would rest. This, he said, was the way of the world, the harmony of light and shadow, joy and sorrow, mother and daughter. Hera, regal and wise, added that the people too would learn from this cycle. They would gather food in times of plenty. They would rest and endure in times of scarcity. And through this, they would come to honor both the gifts of the harvest and the strength found in patience. The cycle would teach them gratitude, reminding them that nothing was eternal except change itself. Athena spoke softly, her eyes full of thought. She said that Persephone's journey was more than law, it was lesson. It showed that even in loss, there could be renewal. Even in darkness, there could be light. And that love was not weakened by distance, but made stronger by the promise of return. The wisdom of the seasons would guide mortals and gods alike, reminding them of the balance that lay at the heart of all things. Demeter, though her heart still ached, listened with care. She did not like the idea of parting from her daughter year after year, but she saw the truth of what the gods spoke. She saw how the earth needed time to sleep, how even the soil itself sighed in relief when allowed to rest before blooming again. Though it was painful, she agreed to honor the cycle, so long as Persephone was returned to her in the months of spring and summer. Persephone too understood. She had walked both worlds, felt the warmth of sunlight and the cool hush of shadows, and she knew now that she belonged to both. She nodded with quiet acceptance, her eyes shining with resolve. She would rise each year to bring life back to the world, and she would return each year to keep balance in the underworld. And so it was decided. The cycle of seasons was born, written not in stone but in the love of a mother and daughter, in the sorrow of parting and the joy of reunion. The gods declared it to be the rhythm of the earth itself, a promise that spring would always follow winter, and that balance would be kept through Persephone's steps between worlds. Each year the story repeated itself, written into the heart of the world like the turning of the stars. Persephone rose from the underworld in the early days of spring, her footsteps bringing blossoms from the soil, her laughter weaving through the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. Demeter welcomed her with arms trembling from longing, her tears falling not from sorrow but from joy. And with their reunion the earth awoke, filling fields with grain, orchards with fruit, and meadows with endless color. Seasons passed in harmony. Through spring and summer, mother and daughter walked together across the land, their love reflected in the bounty that stretched across every valley. Crops grew tall and heavy, flowers painted the hillsides, and rivers sang with life. Mortals rejoiced, their homes filled with bread and their hearts filled with gratitude, for they knew that Demeter's blessing was strong whenever Persephone stood at her side. But as the air cooled and autumn whispered its gentle farewell, Persephone once again felt the pull of the seeds within her. With quiet sorrow, she returned to the underworld, where Hades awaited her with patience carved into his stillness. Demeter wept, her arms empty once more, yet she did not despair as she once had, for she had learned that their parting was not forever. The earth grew quiet in winter, resting in silence. But beneath the frozen soil, seeds waited, and Demeter knew that in time Persephone would return and life would awaken again. This cycle became the promise of the world. Mortals came to understand it too, finding strength in its rhythm. They stored grain for the colder months. They gathered close to fires in the silence of winter, and they sang songs of hope, knowing spring was never lost, but only waiting. They told their children that when the fields lay bare, it was not the end. It was the earth breathing, sleeping, preparing for the joy of renewal. And always, the return of Persephone was celebrated with festivals of flowers, dances in the meadows, and prayers of gratitude whispered into the sky. For Demeter, the promise was carved into her very soul. Though the parting never grew easier, the joy of reunion always outweighed the sorrow of loss. She clung to her daughter each spring, as if it were the first embrace after ages apart, her love burning brighter than the sun. Persephone too found peace, knowing she belonged to both worlds, carrying light into the shadows and shadows into the light, a bridge between realms that kept balance alive. And so the cycle continued, unbroken through the ages. Spring returned because love returned, stronger than grief, stronger than distance, stronger even than the laws of gods. The promise was eternal, woven into the turning of the seasons, into the heartbeat of the earth itself. For as long as a mother loved her child, as long as Persephone rose from the shadows to meet Demeter's embrace, the world would bloom again, and spring would never fade.